Julie? I would like to call the Committee of the Whole Budget meeting of April 12th, 2023 to order. Good evening, everyone. My name is Greg Reimer, Councillor and Chair of the Budget Committee. I would like to begin today by reading a safety notice. In the event of emergency, please evacuate council chambers to the nearest exit through chamber doors and obey all instructions given. And if assistance is required, please see the clerk up in the front here. Once you've evacuated the building, please gather in the front parking lot outside of Town Hall. Also, please ensure you place your cell phones on silent or turn off. And lastly, the Town of Lincoln Council meetings are posted on our YouTube channel. Roll call this evening. All members of council are in attendance, with Councillor Njima attending remotely. We do have senior staff in attendance. Welcome here. Declaration of interest. Are there any declarations of interest this evening? Seeing none. Statutory public meetings. We do not have any statutory public meetings this evening. Delegations number 5. We have no delegations. Number 6, our consent agenda is empty. We have no consent agenda items. Moving along to our regular agenda. We are now considering item 7.1, multi-year capital plan and remapping exercise. This builds on our previous discussions regarding capital projects and the capital works for the town of Lincoln that we had earlier this year during our budget deliberations. Our CEO, Mike Kirkopoulos, will provide some introductory comments. Mike, please go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair. I'm actually going to save my comments till after the presentation when we start the Q&A, and I'll actually just turn over the podium and the microphone to our Director of Finance, Lawrence Wagner.
Director of Finance, Administration, and Innovation, Lawrence Wagner. Go ahead, Lawrence.
Thank you, Chair Reimer. Pleased to be here tonight as a continuation discussion about the budget process. I want to first say I wish I knew where the fire alarm was, because I'd pull it and leave right now. Just kidding. I just want to reiterate something I said through the budget process. The sky is not falling. We're looking at remapping the capital process, and this is starting that engagement process of such. So good evening, members of council. This is the start of the capital plan remapping discussion. Tonight I'll walk you through the items we've discussed before, and so with some new data. The expectation following tonight's discussion will be council direction on debt levels, and following this, the formal remapping of the capital works can begin. This includes introduction of a revamped or revised debt policy. Next slide, please. So, what are we discussing today? We're discussing a variety of items and topics. This presentation is simply the continuation of the overall budget process. It builds on all of our discussions to date. And I have the great pleasure of taking you through the capital remapping presentation, and I will cover things like the capital budget overview, the drivers affecting capital. And some of this is a rehashing of the budget process or the budget discussions, a recap of the current 10-year plan as it looks from a financial projection, our debt projection and reserve balances, talk about that lightly, some recommendations and next steps. Next slide, please. So the capital budget overview, and as a recap, in simple terms, the capital budget pays for both new and existing infrastructure in the town. Funding for capital comes from the capital levy, part of the overall levy, long-term debt, grants, and development charges. Debt can impact the levy to varying degrees. It really depends on the type of work, the amount of levy required, and the access you have to different funding revenue sources. The reasons for taking on debt. One sec. That's what happens when you make notes and all this. Municipalities take on debt or long-term debt to finance infrastructure and other capital assets. In some cases, depending on the municipality's size, service responsibilities, and local policies, it may make sense to borrow in the short term to help maintain municipal services as debt's paid off. Some reasons municipalities use debt are to finance projects, which include spreading out the cost of capital over projects over the useful life. The other reason is simply that you may have limited internal and external funding sources. So The impact of the levy, as I said, is not necessarily funding for capital projects is also included in the operating budget, long-term debt repayments, and the overall levy requirements in the budget year. Capital is also as a pay-as-you-go proportion, funding projects that do not have dollars set aside in reserves and are not large enough for long-term borrowing. So basically put, you don't always have money in the bank, nor you should always, and that's why we did a reserve policy and a reserve threshold to make sure we're prudently using the funds we have and taking out the debt strategically. So borrowing becomes a tool for us. Next slide, please. So you've seen these, you've seen many iterations, the budget process, we talked about these. Some of the drivers driving our capital is growth in the community. This is typically tied to your DC or development charge type of debt or type of development projects, council priorities. Obviously, council has interests and represents the needs in the community, our residents. Health and safety, when it comes to water, our sewer water systems is very paramount. Our asset management plan, we presented the fire, we presented public works and such, and those are help to inform where we need to invest capital and what we need to keep doing. Grant funding, some we get more grant funding, some we get less, drive some of the capital costs, some of the ways we fund capital. Cash flow is a driver. We plan capital based on the available cash flow, our revenues coming in, whether it be DC funds, levy, grants, or the like, user rates and fees. What's impacted us of late, interest rates or borrowing costs. A couple of years ago, our borrowing cost for long-term debt was hovering around 2%. Our current borrowing costs for a 30-year debenture is around 4.15%. And I suspect it will go down over the next term as the long-term bond yields continue to decline. But it doesn't necessarily follow, in fact, tied to like Bank of Canada rates and such. But it's something that's impacting the cost and the cost of service debt. And inflation, like everything, is impacting the cost to provide the materials, supplies, labor that goes into the capital works that the town continues to look at to move things forward. Next slide, please. Oh, I'm sure you'll recall this was presented in the 2023 budget discussions. This illustrates, if you look at the blue line, it illustrates both the 2004 self-imposed debt limit for the town of 10%, and it also has the provincial guidelines. I will say simply, a lot has changed in almost 20 years, and including the need to invest and the amount to fund or support the amount of growth in the community. Next slide, please. So our current debt projection, and I talked about this at council, that we would probably have to exceed the 10% threshold for a short period of time. This is all the types of debt we have. So this is the debt charges projected and approved. These will have a tendency to slip. There's projects that we expected to have start earlier in the year that will probably be later in the year or early next year. But this is an illustrative projection based on a snapshot in time. I spoke to council about the budget process and about the 10% revisit. The ceiling was appropriate for the time, but based on the volume of work and the direction where the town was heading, it would need to be adjusted. You can see that the debt projection will exceed 10% based on the approved works. I will note and reiterate what I said during the budget process. The sky is not falling. In fact, the debt forecast is included in the multi-year forecast that was presented to council. If you recall the projection, i.e. the levy increase, which includes approved debt, for next year it was forecast to be 4.4, following year 1.8, following year 2.5. I built in escalating costs for inflation, QP agreement adjustments and such, so it is manageable. The percentage is greater than, but it's already captured in, and it's a reasonable percentage going forward. So I don't want to scare people and think that there's a huge levy increase coming. It's already been captured. It's already been built into our forecast going out. This is a reasonable forecast. It includes additional or inflationary adjustments, as I mentioned, QP increases, but it does not include new asks for new capital projects. So this is where we are tonight to talk about where we're going forward. I was asked by a council member if we delayed things, would it look differently? I simply said no. I said delaying a year, one or two on projects simply moves the curve out. It doesn't change where you are, shouldn't change your overall forecast. It would have yielded pretty much the same pattern you see in front of you. The question is, really, is can the town or should the town still invest and use debt or simply stay in a holding pattern? I would suggest if you stay at a 10% holding pattern, the town stops doing capital works until 2031. So I don't suggest that's a prudent approach, and it will tend to continue to cost more, and it's not necessarily my best advice. In 2026, 2027, the debt level is approximately 15%, and is still well below the annual repayment limit set by the province. The statutory annual repayment limit is a provincial calculation that limits the amount of a debt municipality can issue without requiring additional approval from the Ontario Municipal Board. You can actually go above 20%, 25%, not recommended, nor is what is being presented to you tonight. So on the next slide, I'd like to break down the debt a little bit more. Next slide, please. So I think I talked to council before in the regards, there's really three different types of debt. So you have your DC debt, which is represented in the green chart, or the green bar graph, the green part of it. The blue is your user rates and fees, which is your water, wastewater costs. And the gray is your levy portion. You'll note that the user rates and the levy portion is significantly under 10%. What's driving the cost, or the cost in this structure is largely your DCing tied to your growth. I would suggest that your 10%, when it was created in 2004, there was limited to growth. It seems to suggest that your user rates and levies should stay under 10%, and that's what I would recommend again tonight. The combination, I'm suggesting at 18%, includes DC debt along with user rates and levy rates, and I think it's possible to do. Some of the controls I would suggest are rolling 3-year average control for DC debt, levy and user rates no greater than 10%, and the water rates should be also considerate of the users that are inputting to it. And you shouldn't be contributing or spending what your expected revenues to 100%, suggesting a more moderate approach of 75%. Next slide, please. So growth projections are expected to remain strong. We continue to be one of the strongest, or the fastest growing local area municipalities in the Niagara region. Thorold outstripped us this year. They're at 6.73%. We're again at 3.2%. We have in our forecast, even in my debt forecast, I projected a very conservative and modest approach on the revenue sources, on DCs, on our user rates as well. So I don't expect any challenges on that sense, so we built some contingency in there. Inflation and interest rates are expected to continue, so I don't see them going down over the short term, and it really depends on how the economy goes. If we do head towards a recession, the economy will react and reduce rates. But overall, I expect it to level off, so interest rates, and we hope it may come down in the next couple of years, which I do suspect will happen. Reserve levels, I think Councillor Mikulik mentioned this in the budget process, have declined, but they're expected to level off. And it's the reason why I put in a reserve threshold and a reserve policy, because you don't want to wake up one day and realize you have nothing in the bank to fund those dips and those challenges. And I suspect, and I would strongly suggest, that we continue to maintain those thresholds so we don't have those aha moments. Capital costs are expected to be largest levy-related costs by 2026. That's all three funding sources, so DCs, user rates, and levy side. Current debt ceiling of 10%, I will go back to again in 2004, did not anticipate the amount of growth this town has experienced, nor is expected to experience over the coming years. So you do have to invest for that. Next slide, please. So I looked at different types of models, different sources. I looked at our next door neighbor in Grimsby, which doesn't have a debt policy or a threshold. Surprised me. I see other municipalities around here have lower thresholds. Some are higher. If I go to Burlington, they're at 13%, I think it is. Oakville has an intriguing one, and I'm trying to model your same approach as Oakville. Oakville capped different types of revenue source, and by debt, they didn't prescribe a ceiling per se, but they described by category type, so that each category, depending on the revenues coming in and the funding sources, had different levels of control. So considering this, I looked at what was feasible. I didn't want to go anywhere close to the 25%, and as I said, you can exceed that. Again, strongly recommend against. I looked at where your existing threshold is, and my suggestion to council is to look at a more moderate approach and look at a percentage around the staged or stacked 18% level. This gives you a small bit of room in 2025, 2026, and 2024 to fund some capital works on a 30-year debenture at a 4.15% interest rate. It's approximately 14 million in new capital works. Obviously, it's subject to user rates and the levy you're going to charge as well. But I suggest not exceeding that. At the same time, you'll note in 2027, 2028, the decline. You have the opportunity again to do a reset. So from the 18%, you can look at 15% or maintain 18%, depending on where you want to go. Quite simply, you can't do the capital plan as proposed, the 10-year one. You have a capital ask of 50 million next year, the year following 70 million, 50 million, 29 million, 20, and it continually declines. I would suspect your annual investment, when you get past the hump, and I will say it again, it's a hump, would probably be around the 15, 20 million per annum basis. And I would suspect that's probably where you're going to have a steady state going forward. Next slide, please. In order to do this, you really need to take a strategic and measured approach. You know, a suggestion, if council so agrees to do an 18% stacked, would be a development charge debt not to exceed the rolling 3-year average of revenues the past 3 years. I looked at 5 years. It seems like there's a slight decline. It doesn't seem appropriate to use 5-year. It would give you more room, but I don't think it's prudent where the development's going. If Prudhoe comes online, it gets adjusted on that sense. And on the flip side, if DC or development charges continue to erode slightly, you have the reserves to kind of buttress yourself for the downturn until Prudhoe comes online. User rate funded debt on a per annum basis is not to exceed 75% of forecasted revenues. It's easy to spend all of your money. I don't suggest that. You continue to put some into reserves so you can fund capital works, not necessarily from debt, but from other sources. You're also in consideration of your users and the residents that use water in the town, that you're not overly raising rates without consideration to them. User rates are to be adjusted annually to meet the debt forecast. If you remember the budget presentation, user rates for water, artificially, you kept the rates low at 0%. It caught up to us at 20%. You cannot do that going forward because it will come back again to bite you in the proverbial rear end. Total user rate and levy-related debt not to exceed 10%. That's your target. So again, if you look at the earlier slide, we're well under the 10%, but I would suggest not going too much farther beyond that. And again, your two controls are the 18%, which is DC, user rate, and levy. The user rate and levy not to exceed 10%. The total value of debt not to exceed 18% combined. Reserve balances, as I keep hearkening to, are to be maintained within approved thresholds to balance, and I'll go back to Councillor Miklick's comment. What happens if an emergency happens, when to purchase something, you maintain reserves for the downtimes and for those like issues. New debt, each year shall not exceed available debt threshold in current or future years. And what I say to that is on an earlier slide, you'll note that in 2026, the debt ceiling or the debt amount that you can take on payments was about $1 million. It's easy to look at 2024, the debt gap or the room was about $3 million. You cannot fund to your maximum in a given year. You have to fund to the maximum in your shortest year, and your shortest year is 2026. It's where you have your biggest pressure and your biggest challenge. An annual report, and I know I had a conversation with another councillor today to be provided to council on debt projection, reserve balances, and any variances on capital works. It's very important that capital overspending is monitored. Any variances on reserve balances, any approvals coming out have to be reported regularly because you're increasing the debt and it's appropriate to do as long as you have the appropriate controls. The question was, would I do more of an annual report or a more regular report? I feel confident with the tools we have in place, with the staff that we have in finance, that a quarterly report, part of the quarterly reporting process, can be provided to council to give you that surety and comfort that things are still on track. Obviously, it requires some support and effort from the staff around the departments that run capital works and such, but I feel confident collectively we can do those. Now, Before we get into any kind of options or approval of any kind of level, I would also suggest that council, before they approve capital works or capital projects, approve the debt policy prior to committing to any capital works, because that's your foundation. That's something that needs to be updated, hasn't been done since 2004, something I think makes sense. I think in anything that when it comes to guidance or support or information coming to her, you should have a measured approach. I would suggest decisions be principle-based, tied to factors like health and safety, cost today versus savings, so cost-benefit analysis, and council priorities as some. Next slide, please. So tonight's recommendation is to seek council's approval on the following: that council approve the total user rate and levy-related debt not to exceed 10% target, and that council approve the total value of debt not to exceed 18% combined, and that council direct staff to bring forward on an annual report debt projections, reserve balances, and variances on capital works. Let me be clear tonight. This is not the approval to actually proceed with capital works. That's a budget decision. That's what council endorses. You need to go through the process. You need to give guidelines and guideposts. It's kind of like getting a credit card and asking for a credit limit. You need to provide that to staff so they can come back with you with a few different types of options for council to consider. Council ultimately, at that point in time, after the debt policy is approved, has the ability to approve or deny what's presented to you. It's not the 18% approval to fund capital projects at this point in time. It's simply endorsement to go forward, to have staff come forward with some options for council to consider on capital works. Next slide, please. So if all goes as planned, tonight's the kickoff. Capital debt continues on the 24th. I would assume that's the debt policy, assuming that we can turn it around that fast, which I think is possible. Capital debt or capital project remapping options sometime in May. Continued discussions, because I think there'll be a couple iterations on the different types of options presented to council. Continued in May. Revised capital plan approval sometime in June. And again, even the revised capital plan approval is not the budget approval. That comes through the 2024 budget process. With that, I'd like to open it up to, next slide, questions, comments, clarity. It's your last time to grill me, guys.
Thank you, Lawrence. Just before that, our CEO would like to make a few comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And as Lawrence said, this is one of his last few meetings, so I'll make some comments on that towards the end. But I do want to thank Director Wagner for his presentation. And I think as Lawrence culminated towards the end of his presentation, really the focus tonight is on the debt policy, because that comes first. That's the foundation, and we do have a 20-year-old policy that needs to be updated. And I think you've heard that from Lawrence for the last number of years, but even before that, we always talked about there'd be a time to look at that policy and to look at updating that policy. So in future meetings, we will tackle the list of projects. I think everyone wants to get to those projects, and we'll determine what gets pushed out and what doesn't get pushed out. I think what you've heard from Lawrence for some time now is we're in good financial shape. But it is incumbent upon us to look at our capital projects to determine what needs to be spread out so that we can have financial sustainability moving forward. Financial sustainability is having a plan, knowing where our costs are coming from, where our revenues are, and all of this we need to know not just for the present, but for the future as well. Municipalities are expected to borrow. That is why the province allows us to do it and sets limits. The process we've started tonight is to ensure we get capital projects completed while maintaining financial best practices. Not all of the funds are from the levy, as Lawrence pointed out. Levy and user rates are well beneath the 10% average that was set. What pushes us above that temporarily is the DCs. These projections don't include things council's already asked us to do. And I think about the direction or the requests on a number of occasions from Councillor Brunet when we looked at prepayment agreements, front ending of works. If we do this, that sees our upset limits not reached. We've talked about that extensively. I know I've spoken with Director Bruder and our CBO, Andrew Greenaway, about looking and talking to various developers, which we've started to do, about those prepayment agreements. And I think we're gonna have some success on those. Again, those will decrease the amount of debt that needs to be taken out. So, Mr. Chair, look forward to the questions from council. Thank you. And my comment.
Thank you, Mr. CAO. And thank you, Lawrence, again for your presentation tonight. A lot of those numbers we had seen during our budget, but they put a little spin on them and make them a little more familiar to us. Council, time for some comments, questions, ideas. Councilor Murray, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Through you, Chair, to Director Lawrence, I forgot your last name. Thank you, Wagner. Sorry about that. This is my first time looking at our long-term capital project, so I do have some questions really about a lot of them. But I do recognize that what you're asking us to do is to approve a credit limit, technically, just to say this is how much, this is where we're allowed to go before we have to pause. But that is based on, my understanding is that that is based on forecasts of what we've already said we're going to spend. When I'm looking at this particular one here that's got all of the lines that go right up to the
Yep.
18%. So can I just understand what our options, so if we were to say, you know what, 18% is too much, we're not willing to do that, does that mean that we're cutting these projects down? Does that mean, which is, again, I recognize another conversation for later on, but this 18% is based on what we've already approved, is that right?
Through you, Chair Reimer, to Councilor Murray, no. So what you've approved gets you up to, in 2026, 2027, a 15% debt. And that's already built in your forecast. If you do nothing, that's where you are. It's built into the forecast that I provided. It's 4.4. It's already captured. The line underneath, it's not that yellow line that you see up there, the yellow bar chart, is the additional funding or the additional debt. So those are payments that you can take on a per annum basis to on top of what you have today. And it's still a council decision to do. So you have options to stay at 10%, which means, as I said during the presentation, you do nothing till 2031. You cease capital works. You have options to do potentially a 15%, which means you don't do capital works till 2028. If you go to the 18%, you can do capital works, but at a slower pace. Councilor Russell asked me, what does this plan look like? 10-year plan? This is a 20 to 25-year plan at best, because your sustainability should be around the 15 to 20 million threshold, but you need to get past the hump. So the orange is your additional debt capacity at 18%. It represents, on a 30-year debenture at 4.15% interest, approximately $14 million of capital works. That's all.
Councilor Murray, follow up?
Not right now, thank you. Thank you, Lawrence, appreciate that.
Councilor Brunet, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair, through you to Lawrence. So Lawrence, I'm just wondering if you could just go back and just kind of explain to me that 4.15 interest.
Yep.
And you said that equates to $14 million annually?
No, yeah, but, so, the one, I think it's easier to put up the slide. Can we, maybe slide, hold on a sec.
Do you have the page number, Councilor? You know what page that's
Slide
on?
9.
Oh, slide 9, okay.
Yeah. Oh, I think it should up there. If I'm to look at that, the 1.089 is the amount of debt I can carry. So depending on the type of debenture, if I do a 10-year debenture, obviously it decreases the amount of capital works because it's a shorter period, larger payments going out, longer period extends payments, makes the payment smaller. If you, as an illustrative example, if I was to do a 30-year debenture and I had $1 million that I could actually pay in debt payments at a 4.15% interest rate over 30 years, it would equate to 14 million. So you have, for the next 3 years, approximately 14 million in capital works you can, yes. Because you can't exceed the 1.089. That's your debt capacity you have available. Following that, you'll see a precipitous drop, 2027, 2028, where you start building capacity. And then that point, you will be at the sustainable part, the 15 to 20 million, because you now have the funding room to do.
So through you, Chair, just to to expand on that or clarify, so that's based on, I guess obviously, we're not borrowing 30-year debenture through a bank, so that's Infrastructure Ontario, or what is that?
Yeah, if you were borrowing from a bank, you would be paying
8%.
significantly more. You'd be
8%,
paying
so-
8, 9%.
Yeah.
Depends on your credit rating and how much collateral you have on hand. The province is one of your cheapest sources of debenture or debt, and it remains to be such.
Okay, so don't get ahead of me. I'm not the financial guru here, so
Yeah.
don't treat me like a. So I'm just trying to understand.
Yep,
We're talking about 4.15% today.
yep.
If we were talking about this in 2019, pre-COVID and pre-inflationary pressures, was that number 2%? Was that number 1.8%? Like, has it doubled?
I'm through your chair, I forgot to say that to Councilor Brunet. Yes, it has. So on our debt schedule, looking at older projects, there were some debentures that we taken out at like 1.93. So yes, cost of money has gone up. The Bank of Canada continues to raise rates. The good thing is that the long-term yield on bonds has continued to go down, which also ties to long-term debt. So I suspect it will go down again. I don't suspect you're going to see a 1.93 in the short term, but I expect it to stay there. And it is cheaper than you taking out the same type of debt.
Right. Okay, so that's where I was trying to go. I was trying to just get some context of where we are, where we've come from, and maybe where we're going. And you're confident that Infrastructure Ontario will continue to be able to borrow money at roughly that same number. It's not going to go exponentially up like it has done for over the last 3 years.
No, if I'm looking at the market and looking
Yeah.
at the trends,
Okay.
watching the economists and such like that, no. The yield is such. I keep watching the 10-year yield, to be honest with you. I don't know why. My wife, I think I drive her nuts. But I watch that for myself because I'm trying to figure out myself which makes sense to hop into GICs and my own investments. So don't expect it to stay there. This has gone back to probably where it was in 2008 when borrowing, if you remember your house prices, we've gone back to a normal state, but it's still cheaper than going to a bank.
Okay, that's great. Thank you. Through you, Chair, if I could ask another question,
ahead.
and maybe this is to the CAO in fairness to the director as he's walking out the door, as he's leaving the organization. I'm that guy. I'll be fully transparent. He referred to a counselor that called him, and I'm that guy that asked some of those questions. And so when I asked our director, and I asked him specifically about, how often, how regular we need to have these reports coming back, and he was very clear with me that we should be pushing for quarterly reports. So I guess I'm asking because I'm concerned. I think we all should be concerned that to make informed decisions, we have to have that information moving forward. How can we be rest assured that, moving forward, 2024, 2025, that, we're going to get quarterly reports from the appropriate people? Like, things change. CAO might not be here. We might not have a new council. How do we, we're hearing we have a debt policy that's 20-some years old. How can we ensure that the changes that the director is implementing are going to be implemented moving forward?
Go ahead, Mr. CEO.
Through you, Mr. Chair. So I probably answer it two ways to the councillor. One is, there's definitely direction and or motion that can be provided, and we can actually put it into the policy. So some of the things we were talking about with the chair and vice chair in terms of where our debt limit is and potentially having it go down after that hump is also something that we can put into potential motions and directions. I know Director Wagner wants to jump in, but I would say, Councillor, to your question specifically on what direction we can be provided or what we can do, we can absolutely put that into motions that as we move forward, we come back to you on a very regular basis. I mean, I can provide you that direction, but I can provide you that reassurance, but I do get what you're saying. People change, the organization changes, and so if you need to put something in a motion, I'm looking at the clerk, we can absolutely put something into a motion. Director Wagner?
Through you, Chair Reimer. Thanks, Mike. We've had this discussion myself and Charlotte, and Charlotte's recommendation was also to include this type of information in the quarterly reports. We've had this conversation with the chair and the vice chair of the General Business and Finance Committee and said that was our commitment as well. I think it's as we continue to mature as a structure, as an organization, we continue to find ways to improve, to become more transparent, and provide you the information to help you make informed decisions. So that's already on our radar, something on our to-do plan this year, and you have a commitment from the finance staff or team, and I suspect Charlotte will continue on with that process. She's pretty good, to make sure you have that information. And as Mike said, you can include it in the policy, and I strongly suggest the policy is the framework you need to hold us accountable to.
Thank you. Thank you. Appreciate that response. One final question,
Go ahead, Councillor.
Chair. So I just want to be clear. You made a comment a couple times that you're recommending that moving forward, that our annual investment be somewhere between 15 and 20 million. And you referenced that once we go beyond 2023, that number jumps up to 50 million and beyond.
Through your chair, Reimer, that's
Go ahead, Lawrence.
the current plan as it sits, it's 50 million next year, 70 million, 50 million, it drops down to 29, 20, something like that. But when I looked at the long-term projection, that blip has to be smoothed out. When I look at what you have available as credit and then look at what's opening up potentially to remain at 18%, 15 to 20 million based on current thresholds or percentages. Obviously, if the interest rates go down, it increases your capacity. But that's my best guess at today's point in time. And these are simply that, a point in time. As variables change, interest rates change, inflation change, they have to be kept updated. Same with project costs. Like all of those play a factor.
Thanks very much.
And just to add to Councillor Brunet's first, and you touched on it again now in your answer, these projections are with the higher interest rate in mind. So if that changes those, in the positive, changes those numbers as well.
Yeah, it can also go to the worst, but for sure. And that's, I don't suspect to the worst, I expect it more to the positive.
Yeah.
Where it goes, where the end result is, we have to keep monitoring. And that's what, I think we got to a place this year through the budget process of remapping, looking at all the capital works, making sure we understood the debt, the different types of sources, that we have a better handle and grasp on those types of things.
Thank you. Councillor Russell, please go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you to Mr. Wagner. Again, thanks for all the information. Again, I've been sitting with these numbers since last week. And it hasn't been a great sit, but it is what it is. I'll be honest, again, there's a lot of things that frighten me, a lot of things that scare me. And I think just to get it off the top, I'm looking tonight not to say no to this. I know we do have to have some flexibility just to maintain business as usual and to continue on with the plans that we have in earnest. But I'm looking for something in between that 10 and 8%, and for us to find something, an option in between that to moderate ourselves a little bit. And the reason I'm throwing it out there now is, again, a lot of this is obviously DC related.
Yeah.
And what scares me the most about all of this is not that these projects aren't going to come online, because I do have full faith that they will at some point. The timing may not be on, but that's fine. They are going to be eventual. What scares me is the provincial government and our lack of control over what DC funding looks like down the road. And I'm going to throw it out there. Nobody saw Bill 23 coming, and I know it probably won't have a great impact on us because there's not very many not many rental properties or affordable housing projects in our pipeline right now as our projects are currently constructed. But given that the political landscape in Ontario, there's very few political opposition or realistic political opposition for Ford and his government, so it's highly likely that he gets back in with majority. He has gone 2 years in his 10-year plan to build $1.5 million homes, and he's already behind by about 150,000 or 10%. And when he gets down to 2026, again, prior to our next election, which is when Bill 23 came out again, there is a good possibility that he could double down because he will be further behind at that point. Again, we don't know one way or another, but it's just my feeling, because he does have to build those homes. We have a number of reasons why. The biggest one is immigration. We have to try to, again, create a new population growth that our current population is not. I don't want to get into the weeds on that, but we have to build those homes, and he knows that. And my fear is that he is going to cut those DC charges and put them back to the developer, and it's going to put us into a shortfall. And if we are projecting out now that we are going to be expecting a certain amount, and all of a sudden that gets halved or even 30% off, that puts all of these numbers and all of our plans in jeopardy, and the town in jeopardy. And that's what keeps me up at night when I think about this. Because we don't have control over it. And I know we could, again, push back and write some harsh letters back, but at the same time, there's nothing that we can do. Because at the same time that we say we're against this, the conversation next is we need a handout for a project, or we need funding for this. So we can't be too harsh and bite the hand that feeds us on one side and try to slap it on the other. So I think we're really in a harsh position, and that's what scares me about going too far and counting on these DC charges down the road when we don't have that control, and looking at where we are in the province scares the crap out of me. So I'm wondering if you want to give any thoughts on that. It's a lot, I apologize. That's a question, it's the question, I'll give you a question, Councillor Chambers. It's, what are your thoughts on that? Because again, these are projections that we are going to be trying to living up to, and if those go south, how does that end up for the town?
Oh, through Councillor.
Lawrence, can you afford Adam some more sleep time?
I can afford, I definitely can. So I'm Chair Reimer to Councillor Russell, this is very good. I don't have my crystal ball tonight, but I will relate it to this way. I don't have things that I can't control. I know what I know today. So our forecast is very conservative on that front. We have the reserves to buttress my suggestion of DCs is the rolling 3-year average. As it declines, you obviously decrease the amount of DC investments. The province has iterated a few times that they'll make us whole. I suspect that they will in some way, shape, or form. They have to have a carrot to offer us in order for us to continue to build in the community. I won't argue the fact is you need to build more homes. That will continue to be a mandate. But the same way a builder, they can continue to decrease the amount for a builder. I will go to a Councillor Mikulik discussion. If I don't have the money to build the sewer system, the roads, the infrastructure, the builder can try to do whatever they want. If I don't have the space ready for them to build, they can't build. So just as much as they may try to help out the developer, the town themselves can't afford that as well. So you have your own carrot. They had some resistance from municipalities when they had some outcry, which I think was more of crying wolf, that the sense they're going to be poor because of DC changes and such. It's a cash flow issue. It will be. And I think that's something that will have to be addressed because you need to fund things before cash comes in. But I don't sit there and wait for somebody driving down the road to assume that they're going to get in an accident. I kind of go with the information I have. I have my seatbelt. I've done my best due diligence. I've got my driver's license. I got my insurance. If that driver, the Ontario government, decides to veer into my lane, I tried as much as I can, and hopefully I'm quick enough to react. The controls you have in here with the rolling 3-year average, with some reserves and maintaining a reserve policy, should give you some time and ability to react. And that's what I would suggest in the policy. So the policy is really important to do this kind of stuff. And if you look at the projections, if I look at what the debt, the DC revenues are, based on the 3-year average, you're not taking on any DC projects right now for the next couple of years because the revenue's not there. Until Prudhome's comes online, which I see as probably your biggest challenge, biggest benefit, when Prudhome's comes online, you'll have those more DC coming, but DC-related projects, probably pretty much on a hold for a bit. The only other portion that you're going to be funding from is user rates and levy side. So again, I can't control what the province does. They are the big dog on the block. All I can do is plan appropriately, and I think we have, and we looked at those kind of things by putting in the types of controls. You also have the ability to go up to 25%. Again, I would never do that, but the council has the ability to take up more debt, and you can do that. It just means more burden on the DC side, on a lower cash flow. Again, not suggested.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Chair. That was a good first question. Second question, so what happens then if these DC charges do move out and if they are reduced, either through, again, external forces through the government, or again, they just don't get built in the format and time frame that we're expecting? How does that affect things?
Good thing with DC,
Lawrence?
Well, it would be potentially that you need to fund it from off-source. So you first thing you dig into your reserves. So unless it trickled to zero, you will still have some revenue coming in because there's always going to be some kind of development. Prudhome's, again, is probably your biggest prize, biggest one coming online. Our forecast, again, is built on a conservative number. So we didn't take what was expected, meaning everybody has blue sky ideas. Our forecast, based on what we expected in DC revenues, is also projected to be lower than what the blue sky was, or the blue sky ideas. So I think we have enough contingency, or at least we're conservative in our approach, that, again, kind of protect you. If the sky falls, Councillor Mikulik asked me about another COVID, if things go off the rails like that, nobody can predict that. But I think based on what we've modeled and what we looked at, we've kind of built in some of those safeguards to try to protect the town.
Okay. And last question.
Go ahead, Councillor.
As far as spending controls, again, Councillor Brunet mentioned a little bit going forward. And we've talked about this offline quite a bit. Like, what would you recommend as far as our capital spending controls being implemented going down the road?
Can I ask for clarity on that, Councillor Russell?
So right now, again, this past year, we started with a $50 million capital budget. We got it down to about a $48 million capital budget. Yeah. Going forward, should we try to look at a relatively hard cap on a yearly spend?
Yes.
And what would you implement going forward?
I think after you get through the hump, meaning the next 3 years, it is probably about 15 to 20 million. And it would, again, it depends on the variable of interest rates. It depends on the type of funding source coming in. If all of a sudden DCs come rolling through the doors, you have different things. You may fund more DC projects than you do levy or user rate costs. 15, 20 million based on the total. So I looked at the total quantum. So 50 million, 70 million, 50 million, 29, and looked at projection. 15 to 20 million seems about right. It seems based on a longer term debenture, depending on the type of debenture, because it's based on asset type. It's probably somewhere around in that ballpark. And you do not have a 10-year plan. You have a 20 to 25-year plan, most likely, because there's going to be new stuff coming on. There's going to be cost escalation as well for projects as well. So you need to build that in as well.
And clarification, that $15 to $20 million capital cap, when is that, again, you said there was the hump. Is that after 2026?
That would be 2027 starting. I would probably do a ramp up. I wouldn't recommend the full 15 to 20 million. Again, if interest rates goes down, obviously it increases the amount you can take on. If interest rates remain the same, it'd probably be half, and then you kind of ramp up towards it. But you always maintain that level and should be tracking towards it.
Okay.
Trust you'll sleep better tonight, Councillor Russell.
Yeah.
Councillor Mikulik, go ahead, please.
Thank you very much, Chair. Through you to Lawrence Wagner. Thank you for taking this time. They're challenging numbers for anyone to look at, especially ourselves. Question I have first is, where is the public consultation with this? Where, I mean, you know, there was plenty of people here last night for a subdivision of 38 homes or something like that. But here we're talking about taking on substantial debt, and with levy increases and user fee increases. So, what sort of public? I found out about this morning. This is the first time I'm seeing this morning, and I was teaching. I was cutting the lawn. I had things to do, and then I'm trying to understand and digest this. So where's the public consultation, and how much time do they have to weigh in, or do they get to weigh in?
Go ahead, Lawrence.
Chair Reimer, to Councillor Mikulik, great question. I would suggest that's through the budget process. Again, what you're approving is a debt ceiling. So whether I take out a line of credit to cover off cash flow issues and such, it's administrative. When it comes to the consultation process, I would suggest that's through the budget process. So where you go to the residents, we tell them the budget is open, the engagement. When they look at the capital plan, they get to comment to their ward councillors, their elected officials, on what they like, what they don't like. The engagement process can happen all the way through. You have not an increase in debt. What you have right now is an existing debt. So the budget that's been approved, if you recall, 25, 2026, you're up to 15% debt. What you're asking for, increasing, is a small piece. And again, this is the options that are being presented for you, up to 18%. The options will come back after a debt policy with the different types of projects. At any point in time, residents can comment on those through the budget process. And I would suggest that's the most appropriate venue, is they comment on what types of capital works they like that may shape or influence change through the budget process. That's where I would suggest the engagement is on that process. I think when it comes to the 10-year capital plan, residents, councillors, and others have had input on the types of projects on the list as well. So it's happened. It will continue to happen. It'll continue to happen through the budget process. So full engagement, not so much. Full engagement on the capital works and what they want prioritized definitely should come through the budget process, my suggestion.
Councillor?
I just asked that question because, you know, it's typically when people receive their increases, their tax increases and their water bill increases, that's when they seem to ask the questions, what's happening here? So that's, I'm thinking that we should be proactive on that we should be, that my thoughts are that we should be reaching out to the public to let them know what's going on. Otherwise, if we approve this, I feel as though that's when the gallery gets full.
Yep.
Go ahead, Lawrence.
We do that engagement process. I'll remind council that through the inserts in our property tax bills, we remind them of the budget process. We have Speak Up Lincoln to engage the community. I can't say that everybody's engaged. We have a vocal few. We also do for user rates and fees, the same type of notification. I can talk about the planning and building one that was put in the newspaper and such. We have our council meeting agendas. If they're interested, they can, I'm assuming, and clerk, please clarify, they can ask to be a delegation. They can also send questions to you. I'm sure that you received questions for tonight in that regards, and you're asking them on behalf of the residents. And you're also a conduit towards that. So they are a part of the process, whether formally, public consultation going through you. This is where the process happens. In the budget process, they have, again, the same thing before we approve user rates and fees to come, to ask them questions, to ask questions of you. And I assure you, I had a lot of budget questions this year from all of you. Those come through, and we do take those, and we encourage those.
Councillor?
My next question, just looking at page or slide 5, this was the slide that we received during the budget deliberations.
Yep.
And I'm just wondering, now we're receiving this, you know, the slide 9, which is what's being recommended.
Yep.
Would it have helped, or should we be taking a look at the previously approved projects, the 48 million that we approved? Should we be taking a second look at those to see if we can change that bar graph somehow? You know, we didn't. We only knew what we knew at that time. We didn't know what this bar graph was going to look like. But should we be taking a second look at the currently approved projects?
Through Chair Reimer to Councillor Miklik, no. Emphatically, no. I said through the presentation, and I've had a conversation with other councillors on that regards. Those projects that were approved would have been approved this year, the year following. Some of these projects, and I can talk to Prudhome's as an example, was supposed to start in Q2, it's going to be in Q4, so this natural bar chart will shift. But those projects were priority projects, would have come in year 1, 2, or 3. It wouldn't fundamentally change the graph. You also have all these costs already built into your forecast, and I will go back to the debenture costs and operating costs. The increase for next year would be a maximum of 4.4%. barring any changes and new asks and stuff like that, 1.8% and 2.5%. It really doesn't fundamentally change things. Those were priorities yesterday. Those will be priorities tomorrow. Moving it a year, I would suggest also potentially increased costs. So you don't necessarily get ahead. You have to make a decision on how you want to proceed with the new projects or stuff coming down the pipe. So I don't suggest it's something I would revisit. I will still reflect back onto the budget discussions. The sky's not falling. Everything's there. It's manageable. The forecast includes all these debt projections as well. The question comes is, where do you want to go? When I highlighted that first slide with the debt, I said, you can't do this. It's too large. It's too much. It's too much all at once. You exceed the 25%. That's what needs to be worked on. That's what needs to be solved.
Thank you. And,
Counselor?
my third question.
Go ahead.
So, and looking at that same slide 9, I look at what the debt we had was 2019, 20, 21, 22. I'm suspecting that previous years it was lower or, nowhere near what we're projecting at 2023. And earlier, you mentioned that the current debt ceiling at 10% did not fully consider growth. I don't know what would have been different had we had a 20% debt ceiling since 2004. I don't think that we would have been borrowing up to 20% of our allowable funding. Maybe we would have if we would have been able to, but even with a 10% borrowing limit, town set borrowing limit, we were still pretty conservative from what I can see on this chart. And what's the benefit of growth? So we've had explosive growth. We've got new condos being built. We've got subdivisions all over the place. People are saying we're growing fast. So what should we have considered with growth that we didn't consider?
Dr. Wagner?
Sure, I can try to unpack that. 2004, different world, obviously a smaller community. I looked at the projects, and I only have limited data going back. It goes back apart. I would suspect the council, and I can't speak to the council members here at that time, I would suspect council was very conservative in their approach. What typically happens is similar to the water rates. When you end up having artificially low rates or no investment, you play catch up. Some of this is catch up, things that you may have delayed, decided not to take on or do. You'll also have the exacerbated approach that growth in this community has continued to remain strong over the last several years. 2004, I would suspect you're probably more along the lines of Grimsby, West Lincoln at 1% or less. You have no choice but to match with that. In order to, you asked about growth and what it does. I would say this, the more people that are in your tax base help support the infrastructure and maintenance of costs. If I have one residence and the tax base or the budget is $1 million, that one resident pays $1 million. If I have 1 million residents, each person pays $1. The bigger your base, the principle is the more you can spread the cost over a larger base. So growth sometimes costs you more upfront, but it does have the upside potential to spread the cost over a larger population base. Your issue is, or your risk is on the operating side to control operating costs, not necessarily the capital work side.
Okay, I appreciate that answer. It's just when I'm looking at this, this chart, and I'm trying to associate it with the benefits of growth, I'm struggling to see that. It's, and I understand you need more taxpayers, but it just seems like we have more taxpayers to pay for more debt. And that, I'm trying to understand that. It's kind of complicated for me to understand, but maybe I'm thinking simply, but that's just what I'm seeing. So, thank you.
Thank you, Councilor Mickley. Councilor Patriva, please go ahead.
Sorry.
Oh, my goodness. Okay. Councilor Timmers, you want to go up, please, for a minute? Thank you. Councilor Patriva.
Thank you, Chair Reimer. Sorry, I was quick with my thumb there. And going back to Councilor Mickley's question, Director Wagner, about 2004 and having been the person that's been here since 2003, you know what? We were faced with playing catch up from years and years of a 0% budget. And if I've said it once, I've said it 100 times, a 0% budget is fiscally irresponsible. And we took on the aggressive renewal of our underground infrastructure. We heard last week, not sexy, you can't see it, but is it the right thing to do? Yes. And at $2,005, we were able to do a heck of a lot of that, and we replaced that. You saw our aggressive look at the road network. We started off at $750,000, and then we've upped it to $1.5 million to get to 70%, and 1.8 million and 2 million. The whole thing about this is the benefits of growth have been overridden by inflation. And no one has a crystal ball to see that. So in 2005, Jordan Village project was $4 million. We deferred it. It's $14 million. So that's why we need to increase the debt levels, because those $2005 are no longer $2005, correct, Director?
Through Chair Reimer to Councillor Petrie, that would be a fair comment.
Okay. And then my second point would be, and I'm going to backtrack a little bit, but go out. So when we're redrafting our 10-year capital plan, we used to have in budget looks at that. We had a 10-year capital plan based on the funding threshold that we had set. So in this case, it'll be your $15 million. But then we had a wish list underneath, completely separate, based on additional external funding.
Yep.
So might that be something that we can look at going forward?
Through Chair Reimer to
Director?
Councillor Pastoriva, yeah, definitely. And I think Mike's talked about this before, the budget process. He was talking, Councillor Regima asked about, have we exhausted grant sources or funding sources? For sure. When myself, Councillor Murray, and you, along with Matt Bruder, met with Sam Oosterhoff, our MPP, he talked about ISIP. So the province, go back to your province thing, they were saying that they're going to increase the amount of ISIP, so the investment program, the grant program. If we have projects eligible for there, yeah, you definitely tap into those. So yeah, we definitely look at those kind of things to do. Province may give or may not, but we will.
Okay. And my third question.
Go ahead, Councillor.
Chair Reimer. Yeah. So those of you who know me, and Councillor Bernay will probably get a smile on his face, there's a bunch of things that rattle around in my head from AMO and Roma and OGRA, living snow fence, fiberglass bridge replacement, Python 5000, a pothole filler, looking at lease versus buy, which we did institute and was quite proud of that. But my other one is from a lunch and learn. Oh, and I can't forget the service utility on lateral line replacement, the insurance program that we brought out that, again, we learned about at lunch. But one of the things that always has stuck from one of those sessions was the City of Edmonton. So the City of Edmonton created a utility from their water and wastewater department, and then were able to self-fund through that. Now, is that something, like outside the box thinking, borrowing from yourself, is that something that was just available to the province of Alberta, or is that something that we might be able to explore? Like you know, and again, it's that US-based model where you put your mortgage within your retirement funds and then you're actually paying yourself. So looking at a completely different way to fund, is that something that's a possibility?
Director.
Through you, Chair Reimer to Councillor Petrie. I can't speak to that one, but I have had discussions with Public Works in regards to charge-out rates and different options to generate different revenue. So we have equipment that's sitting aside. Other municipalities do charge-out rates and charge fees for that, so it's a possible revenue source. I talked to Charlotte about a potential revenue source for charging mortgage companies for transfers on property tax. Yeah, there's always options, and it's something to always explore. No different than your holdings in Penn West. There's other options you can explore, and I know Mike's diligently looking at other things to kind of push the needle, check things out. Not everything's viable.
No.
But you definitely, I think you have the staff and the team here that would be willing to explore those types of discussions, at least to explore and see if it's,
Yeah, terrific, because if you don't ask, you won't know,
Nope.
correct?
yes, sir.
And it's time to ask. Thank you.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Timmers, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Reimer. So, boy, there's a lot of conversation happening here tonight. So, from what I understand is we need to update a 20-year-old debt threshold policy for the town. It's basically what we're here doing tonight. And Lawrence, you said that some municipalities don't have a debt threshold policy. Are we mandated to have that policy, or is that something that we put in place ourselves?
Through you, Chair Reimer, to Council
Go ahead,
Timmers.
Director.
Charlotte will probably correct me if I'm wrong, but you're mandated to stay within the 25% from the province. So the province tells you what you must have or not. Your policies inside, what thresholds such, is really you and what your capacity are. Because if I look at Oakville as example, they set the different thresholds by different revenue types. Burlington has a flat, I think it's 13 or 15%, all over the place. In Niagara region, generally conservative. Grimsby, when I consulted, because I asked my colleagues what they have and what they have in place, has none. Asked me if I can send them ours when it's done. Mind you, they have their own challenges because their finance director is going to the region, but yeah, I hit or miss. I've seen some good ones and interesting ones, had some philosophical debates on what is the most appropriate. Council gets to determine that.
Okay, so I understand that setting that threshold is, within the municipalities, whatever they decide to set it at based on what their growth, what their projects are coming, and what their debt they project. So you also said that everything we've approved to date puts us at a 15% threshold. Did I hear that correctly?
Yeah.
Already? We're already at that?
Through Chair
Go ahead,
Reimer to
Lawrence.
Councillor Timmers. Yes, so it would put you at 2025, 2026, you'd be at 15%. As I said, it's already built into your forecast, the 4.4, the 1.8, the 2.5, so we've already captured it, we've already modeled it out. And just remember, the 18%, council has just as much as you created in 2004, or 10%. Whatever you agree to tonight or today can change again in 5 years if growth falls off. You can revisit it. And I strongly suggest, with all policies, you revisit them on a regular basis. Things change, assumptions change, drivers change. So definitely something you have the ability to change, shape, form. You have the ability in 2028 to do a staged approach. So when to my neighbors next door, tell them when they woke up with a hangover and found out they had all this debt, they kind of staged it down. And my trusted colleague there had them go down to a stage step. In 4 years' time, you can do the same thing. You can go down to 15%, you can remain at 18%. You need to do these on a regular basis because things and inputs change. And that's what I'm suggesting, that you have a hump, you have to deal with the hump. You can make the change, you can decide not to, council's prerogative. We will draft whatever policy and controls that I think are appropriate, and we can go from there. And you can readjust it in future as well.
Okay, well, that sounds like a good plan in my mind. So we're well below the 25% of provincial guidelines at 18.
Yep.
So, these are all projects, these are all priorities, things that we as a council and councils prior years have made these decisions. So it's, as what Councillor Pachariva just said, dollars in 2004 are not the same as they are today. If you had a 20-year-old credit card with what, a $500 limit, how far would you get with that today? Not very far. So I'm totally fine with this and I'll be supporting it, so thank you.
Thank you, Councillor Timmers. Mayor Easton, please go ahead.
Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you, Lawrence, for your report. And I guess there isn't much point in going back and looking what's happened in the past unless we're going to learn something from it. But I think you've provided us with enough current information that we can look forward. So there's a lot of things to consider here, but what I like about the approach that you've taken is that you've laid out a circumstance for us that over a period of time, you've identified the hump, if you want to call it that pinch point. You've given us some options to manage the pinch point, and you've also given us some realistic steps that we can take following that to get on a track, whatever we decide that track is going to be. But it's all based on controls.
Yeah.
It's based on a plan, and it's based on monitoring the controls, which I think is all perfectly reasonable. So one of the things that I'd like to reflect on for a moment is some of these principles that we have used, because I want to know whether or not borrowing from ourselves really was the bright idea that we thought it was at the time. And it was easy for us to borrow from ourselves because we had already collected money that was in trust. And we couldn't spend that money, and we weren't ready to hand that money off. So it seemed like a good idea. But what did it teach us about how we should manage our affairs going forward? Or was it really a false sense of security in terms of making an easy decision, not having to really deal with what was coming down the road?
Director Wagner?
Oh, through Chair Reimer to Mayor Easton. That's a tough one. This is why we went through the reserve policy and the thresholds, because you can sit on too much savings. It's that comfort blanket. In some regards, some councillors like a bigger blanket, some like less. You have to balance all those things. If I'm borrowing internally and I'm funding something, and if I borrow, like if I kept the cash and I invested it versus paying off debt, you have to balance all those things. I would suspect after our review that you probably were not obviously earlier in the sense, you were probably sitting on too much savings and you were basically had dead capital. So not efficient use of capital. With all businesses, with all towns, there's a modicum or reasonable amount of debt you should do. It's the proper use. Obviously not too much debt. So borrowing from yourself is a conservative approach. It's somebody very risk adverse. I would suggest that it's probably not the appropriate thing when you have this much growth and this much capital work coming your way and this much demand in your community. You can't sustain that type of approach with a consistent growth pattern you have. I would also suggest in order to accumulate that much surplus, and meaning savings in your reserves, means you overtax people. So you're trying to balance out all of those kind of things. So all these come into consideration. So do I think it was prudent? Probably not. Do I think maybe they delayed on investing because they wanted to keep their safety blanket for a longer protracted amount of time? My guess is yes.
Well, actually, I just want to be clear, we weren't delaying the investment. There was no investment to be made because the province made decisions which made it impossible for that project to go forward until recently. And it happens to be the hospital project, so
that's one.
that's why the money was collected. Okay, well, that gives me a pretty good idea. I mean, I think what you're presenting to us now is a scenario that will cause us as a council, whether it's this council or future councils, to operate from a very tightly prescribed, but realistic, not too conservative, but not too loose in terms of how we move, and it will provide us with opportunities, a time frame at which we should be considering a rework, and that more often than we've been doing in the past. Is that fair enough?
Through your Chair Reimer to Mayor Easton.
Go ahead, Director.
That's 100% on the nose. You cannot wait 20 years to review things,
Right.
considering all the changes that's happened in this community. No.
Okay, I want to talk about austerity for a moment. So I'm not a fan of playing financial games in order to feel good when I'm dealing with public money. And how I manage my private money is completely different to the way I manage public money, because I'm here to build the community.
Yep.
I'm not here to feel good because I make a decision and do nothing. So I want to be very frank. When I became mayor, there had been too many years of doing very little or nothing. And there were a lot of reasons for that don't warrant any criticism. But that's just the way it was. So the last 8 years, now into the 9th year, the financial circumstances of the town have been quite different. There was not a recession. There was a long period of recession, whether it was warranted as a provincially announced recession. It was certainly a recession in many communities, and Lincoln was still considered a have community and has been for a long time. However, to make a decision that would cause us to be looking at this set of current circumstances as a slump versus a boom concerns me. Because for several years now, I've been talking with the CAO about exactly what you've done here. Not in this way. We are not financial people, but it's just strictly a logical prospect that you're going to have a lot of money coming in through development charges. You've got services that have to be built up before you can even begin. Some you will do after the fact. You have parks to build. You have a lot of amenities that go along with building your community. And so I guess the question then becomes, when do you do that? Well, it depends on what the ideology is, I suppose, but if money is coming in, that's when you should be putting money aside, and when you have that money available, then you start to spend it. So to a certain extent, we've been doing that. However, we're getting into a bit of an imbalance because, and I don't know whether you would agree with this or not, but there is not enough development. Approved development is not moving at the pace that we expected it to. So I realize that this is a financial exercise, but the planning department has the greater potential than almost any other department within the town to generate revenue through development charges. And if the developers stop developing or they slow the pace down and they create an imbalance in terms of that cash flow, that's a problem for us. So have you talked with Mr. Bruder about whether or not we need to do something about speeding that process up and putting some pressure on them?
Director?
Through Chair Reimer to Mary said, I haven't talked specifically about that. I talked more about the forecast in the amount of housing units coming online through development. They are definitely a revenue generating department, meaning they facilitate and move things along. They approve applications, they come to council, they approve the developments that come, and obviously that increases your revenue coming in. So they're definitely a big part of the puzzle. They're the front end process when it comes to development charges. So haven't talked specifically to Matt about that, but I did talk about the forecast, so I had an idea, understanding of what a reasonable forecast was and such. But I do think they're a partner, and they have the ability to help shape, help influence where we have monies coming in. As Mike is having conversations with developers about front-ending contracts, they have
Right.
the same ability to do such. So yes, I think that department's very important in this process. And I apologize he's not here tonight. I'm sure he would have more to say about that as well.
Okay, well, that's, I just wanted to put that on the table. You didn't fall over in a dead faint, so I'm assuming that it's not such a crazy idea.
Excuse me, Mary. Mr. Bruder is on, and I
Oh, there he
think he
is.
had his hand up there.
Oh, maybe he fell over.
Go ahead. Well, he's sitting now. Go ahead, Director Bruder. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Can everybody hear me okay?
We can.
Yeah, I think just to add to that, I mean, we are looking at general ways, you know, it is true, we move applications along. We're looking at ways to do that more efficiently. We're looking at process changes. We're going to be coming to council soon. Some of it, again, being mandated a little bit by the province, but some of it also just being the right thing to do. So while Lawrence is right, we haven't necessarily talked about exactly how we address your comments, question, your worship. I think we're generally just looking for opportunities always to streamline and move things along best we can, where we can. So I just wanted to add that. Thank you.
Okay, and I appreciate that very
Thank you,
much,
Director.
Mr. Bruder. And I think actually what made me start thinking about this was when I was really feeling badly about my colleague, Mr. Councillor Russell, staying awake at night, and I thought that maybe this might be part of the solution, because certainly I know that the large cities, Lumco and Marco, they have been after the province with very, very specific numbers on the amount of land that has been approved for development and the work that is not being done. It's a serious, serious problem. And so you can't take away development charges and at the same time remove all revenues because there could be financing reasons. There's no end of reasons why they wouldn't move forward. So I will continue to be curious about how we can push that to bring better balance to our circumstances, for sure. Mr. Chairman, I believe that what we're going through should be seen as a normal course of events. We have circumstances, we have had circumstances evolving over the last couple of years. We needed a new model. We knew we needed a new model. We expressed it in many different ways. You provided us with that model. This model will probably be good for the next couple of years, and we should be looking at it again, but it's firmly in place. And if this is what's going to constitute the policy, then I'm satisfied that we are being not only prudent but highly accountable. And so I look forward to having the hard discussions that we're going to have in the future and doing the best that we can for our community. Thank you. Thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mayor Easton. Just to pick up, before I go to Councillor Russell, just to pick up on some of Mayor Easton's first comments, extrapolate on it a little bit. This is more than just a raising our debt threshold. There is safeguards and there's support around that. There's safeguards built in. I think the biggest thing of this is our commitment to continue to review our reserve controls. I think that's a big part of this. So I don't like to look at that. 18% can be a daunting figure, but when you add the other components that we have to this, I think it's a good move forward. Councillor Russell, go ahead.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you back to Lawrence. I'm going to put you on the hot seat for a quick second, maybe.
That's all right.
Again, throughout this process, obviously you're advocating for us to increase our debt. I'm going to ask a simple question. Why are we not advocating to spend less?
Because I think it's short-sighted. I'm sorry, through Chair Reimer to
Go ahead,
Councillor Russell.
Director.
I think it's short-sighted. It tends to be, it's kind of like the question, I'll keep going back to the water rates. Do 0%, because I want to make the residents have no rate increases. Problem is, it bites you in the proverbial rear in a couple of years' time. It catches up. So if I delay projects and spend less, I still have the project, because it's still something the residents have inputted, council members have inputted, it's still a priority. It doesn't disappear unless you remove it from the list. It's still there. So it's continually going up in cost. Construction costs continually go up. It doesn't go anywhere. Eventually, I have things that are potentially falling apart, buildings coming into decay, other things as such. So I have to play catch up. At that time, the cost for doing such all at once is very prohibitive and would be very impactful to your residents. Taking a strategic, slow, methodical approach, moving the needle bit by bit, again, suggestion 20 to 25 years with modest increase with some kind of cap, doesn't negatively impact your resident at a large scale. And that's what you are potentially doing. So if I spend less and those projects stay on the list, when they come to fruition and when they come to roost, I have a large hangover, and I go back to Pelham, I wake up with a big debt that I have to pay up, and that's not where you want to be, nor do I think it's prudent for your residents.
Okay, thank you. And through you, Mr. Chair. So again, not to be argumentative, I didn't say to stop spending. I said to spend less. And so with that in mind, like, are we putting the cart before the horse by increasing our ceiling before we start needling through that 10-year capital plan? Because I guarantee you there are some on there that are not necessarily needs, they're wants. And again, to a former counselor or to a counselor's point earlier, they may have been approved or may have been considered by a few or previous councils, but they may have no regard into what we actually need to actually do or have to do to fulfill our risk and our needs for our residents. So I'm wondering why we're doing this now, increasing our ceiling before going through and looking at next year's plan, the year after that plan, even the next 5 years.
Go ahead, Director.
Through your chair, Reimer, to Councillor Russell, because if you didn't, to be honest with you, you need to give guideposts. If I gave this, if I gave this to staff and said, come with a proposal, everything would come back to you, every single item. You would have the same debate philosophically on the 50 million to spend it all. Having the guidepost restricts us as staff to come back with a plan. If you recall what I said in one of the slides, is that you also need to have it linked to certain kind of principles. I'll say that quite simply: health and safety, council priorities, cost benefit analysis, why are you doing this? Some rationale or reason needs to be tied there. If you do not give the guidelines, a $50 million plan will come, 48 million were approved, you cannot fund that much. You need to have what I would consider is it's more of an upper control limit. You have an upper control limit, come back with options A, B, C, D. Within that control limit, council to decide. I would not recommend coming back with a full list because you're going to end up with a full list being suggested to approve. This approach allows you to have some options that are financially or fiscally sustainable. I've talked about this before. I looked at it from that approach. If I give carte blanche, we will have a long laundry list. In this regards, staff will have to come back, prioritize, give their best foot forward, give their best business case, the rationale, linkages to all your priorities and such. I think you'll get further along the process in that way. You can always add more to it. I don't suggest
More debt?
it. Yeah, if you want to go past 18. But I think you need to give guideposts because, again, if you come back, certain areas, and again, everybody has their interests and have different priorities. I'm going to talk about Dave for a second for Public Works. Obviously, sewer and wastewater is very important for them. Probably supersedes Shannon's parks. But I would say both weigh the same. If you give them the same playbook to say, this is all you get to spend, figure it out, you'll get a more conducive and more, I think, better options, to be quite honest with you. And you can kind of do your menu. To me, it's like a menu. Pick your menu items and go from there. And without, as I talked to Mike, going the nuclear option, which is 25% and above. Sky's the limit on debt. I don't think that's the way you want to go. And just remember that these are simple options coming to you. Council has the right to approve. And finally, through the budget process, you can make changes again. You know, there might be a new project coming online. BDSS may be accelerated faster than we anticipate. It may bump something through the budget process. So I encourage you to look at it that way, that you give the guideposts, direct staff to come back with some options, and then debate from there, because those should be their best foot forward, and you can make your choice to say moving this one and moving this one out. Because otherwise you will again have 50 million in ask next year, 70 million the year following, 50 million. And I'm maybe being pessimistic, but that's what I think might actually occur.
So again, thank you. And last follow-up.
Go ahead.
Again, in reference to those guideposts, we have the guideposts now at 10%. And I know, again, based on what's coming up, we've already surpassed that in a theoretical way. But we have the guideposts. So why not just stick to those guideposts and let that be our ceiling, and then go case-by-case basis or year-by-year basis, say, okay, listen, like we need to get these ones done. Have council approve on a yearly basis. We're going to go above the threshold by 2%. Next year, we're back at 10. Something else comes up, we go back up. Instead of giving us that spending credit limit, and then more than like, again, just based on anecdotal experience, we're going to spend to that limit. And that's what I'm afraid of, and that's what I find is risky.
Through your chair, Reimer, to Councilor Russ, you already have, so I did suggest the 10%. So on the levy and user rate, I still suggest that being a control factor. DC debt is truly different. It's driven from outside, it's not the resident. And my concern would be the resident, you know, taking unbridled debt and coming up with costs that you can't support going forward. you can put the 10%, but the amount of projects you have, and I'll remind you, 50 million next year, 70 million, 50 million, 29, 20, you can't do what you're doing without fundamentally shutting a whole bunch of things down. You need to be slow, methodical, strategic. The cap makes sense. You just cannot do everything as fast as you guys have been trying to do, and as quickly as you're trying to do at that volume. It just has to be smoothed out. Suggesting to do the one-off projects, I will look at this council and go, all of you have different interests in your wards, different projects that you've been on your slate. To get agreement, to have one project going forward, the council and my experience so far, be very difficult. So philosophy, the philosophy makes sense, resonates with me. In practical terms, impossible to do.
Follow-up, Councillor, you okay?
Yep.
Councillor Murray, please go ahead.
Thank you. Through you, Chair, to Director Wagner. I really do appreciate the structure and the design of this policy, and I really like the dynamic thresholds designed around the various revenue sources. I think that makes a lot of really good sense. But I am concerned about the change from 10% to 18%. And not to put words in Councillor Russell's mouth, but I think I would agree with him that I think there's a risk of us spending to that threshold, that not being the outer limit, but that being what we're heading for. That's what we're trying to achieve. And I'm a little bit, I'm concerned about that. I think that that's a risk, especially if we look at, as you said, the sheer volume of projects and the way that we're trying, that council is working really hard to get so much done.
Yep.
And I think it changes the conversation around what has to happen. If we have a constraint around spending, that changes what becomes necessary to happen this year or next year. And so I think what I need to know from you is, can you clarify for me again? I know that you did, but I'm struggling with a little bit. If we don't approve this policy with the 18% debt threshold, but instead keep it at 10, put it at 15, what is the consequences of that? What happens this year if we do not approve it the way it's been recommended?
Director?
Through you, Chair Reimer, to Councillor Murray, nothing, because you have it built in for every debt item on there right now, even up to the 15% is already built into projections. It's been captured. If you don't approve it, you essentially shut off capital works. If you go to 15%, I think you start capital works again in, assuming that's your threshold, 2028. If you go back to 10%, including DC debt, which again, I do not recommend, it's a different funding source. I could always consider what the resident's paying, whether it's user rates or levy. If you go to 10% all in, 2031 is when new capital works start. You will have structural issues with some of your capital works, infrastructure, roads and such that will be coming. You have new communities coming on board that will push roads to come online. You can't. Quite simply, you can't shut it down. You have to control it. And as I'm saying, the next couple of years, you have to smooth the curve. It starts opening up those kind of things. And I will continue to refer back. This policy needs to be revisited in 2027 approximately, when you start creating room and seeing if you start stepping down the threshold again.
Councillor?
Yes, thank you, Lawrence. I'm concerned that it's similar to when you put something in a budget and now that's just our starting point now. That's that you never come back down again. That's my concern. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Councillor Patriva, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair Reimer. And again, that, you know what, and I think you've said it a number of times, Director Wagner, but by establishing that 18% threshold does not mean you have to spend to that, because at budget, you have the opportunity to look at it and evaluate it. So it's, in essence, it's an upper limit, and you can see going out that you're not going to come close to hitting it, correct?
Through you, Chair Reimer, to Councillor Petrie, 100%. And I would suggest that the options coming towards you can also be modeled out on how much rate increases are coming for water, how much levy impact it would be. Council has the decision point at that time, and then go to Councillor Murray's, because if it's all levy funded, and assuming you take out $1 million of new debt, it's approximate, it's less than 5%, but say 5% for the sake of argument, that adds up to the 4.4. You have the rights as council to go, we aren't good with 9.4. We want 2%, and then we have to rework those budgets. Yes, you're right that sometimes things get built in and they continue on. I'm not suggesting that. And you have a cap to give people the wherewithal to kind of model out what that means for their lines of business, come to council. At the same time, I can give you what the user rate cost would be, depending on mix of capital works, and what the levy impact would be. And then council can decide their comfort with whatever increase they want for the residents. If you don't have those types of things, you can shut it off and you know what your forecast is. If you do not have those type of things, then you run the risk of having a 10, 15% increase, which is probably more problematic than the approach that I'm suggesting.
Another, if I may, Chair
Go right
Reimer?
ahead.
So, and again, Lawrence, a few years ago, I mean, when we used to talk budgets, it would be an arbitrary number we would pull out of the air. A feel-good number, right? And we made that shift to budget's going to be tied to CPI. So that's still one of our parameters?
Through you, Chair Reimer, to Councilor Petrie, that's tied to your capital works.
Yes.
And we typically raise it by 1.5%, but
Exactly, yeah.
last year we held it to that.
Yeah.
It wasn't kept to CPI because I think last year's number for CPI
Well, it would have
is
been
an
seven, would have been
anomaly.
seven to start, right? Yeah.
Yeah, and
Yeah.
considering all the budget requests that we had right now, we tried to keep it somewhat reasonable.
Okay.
But yeah, it's definitely tied to that.
Okay, excellent. And then my third one, if I may, Chair?
Go right ahead.
And again, you know what, and the mayor said this, it's a shift in ideology, right? So my years on council, you know what, and it's the first thing out of the budget book was a slide called the debt spiral of death. That debt was seen to be going off the cliff. And unfortunately, that wasn't the way to look at debt. You know, there's good debt, and there's bad debt, and there's consumer debt, and there's infrastructure debt. And we've come around to look at, you know what, debt is not a bad thing. Debt, like we used to do one project a year and debt fund that. And that was I want to say the appetite of council because of the adverseness to debt. But we've been now taught that in order to get some of these things done, like the Fleming Center and that, you need to take on debt. But it's managing that debt. And you've laid out a forecast and a structure that will allow us to do that, correct? And still have some confidence in it, and still at budget, have the ability to move some of the deck chairs around.
Through you, Chair Reimer, to Councilor, 100%. So,
Yeah.
but going to your example, like Fleming Center, if you do a big project like that, and I'm going to make it akin to Jordan Lyons Park, that would be your one project
Yeah.
for the year. So the cap allows you to prioritize. In some regards, depending on the quantum of a project, the size of the project, may limit you to one. I would go back to your old part. You have to understand the revenue sources and the type of debt the revenue source is funding. Again, DC funds, it's not levy related. If I have one capital work, so Jordan Lyons Park, 15 million hypothetically, and it's all levy funded, and it's over 10 years because you do it based on the life of the asset. And mind you, park would be longer than that. And it's all going to the levy side, I would be concerned because I have
Yeah.
to struggle with or grasp the operational costs that I have to deal with, the escalations on the operation side, plus the increased debt. So, depending on where you were at that time, it may do what Councilor Russell said, keep them up at night.
Yeah.
But if it's funded from DCs, less so. If it's spread out and I'm being methodical and strategic about it, you can manage.
Yeah.
I look at debt myself for how much I want to take out in the stock market, extra debt to find. There's good debt and bad debt, different sources.
Sure.
Yes, for sure.
Sure, and it's that, again, it's that move from funding through the levy, the debt,
Yeah.
as opposed to a long-term debenture, that then spreads it out over a certain time period, so not only are the residents now paying for it, but the future residents are also picking up that cost. the ones moving in. And that's the way that it should be looked at. And I think if we look at something like the Fleming Center, all of us would say that was the right thing to do.
Yeah.
So, thank you. Thank you, Chair.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Mikulik, please go ahead.
Thank you very much. Just a quick question. With debt, similar to everybody and every business and every corporation, there is a risk to credit rating. Would increasing our debt limit from our town set limit from 10 to 18, would that have an effect on our credit rating? And I'm not sure currently what it is, and would it have an effect?
Director Wagner?
Through Chair Reimer to Councillor Mikulik. Credit ratings are usually when you take out borrowing or you're issuing bonds and stuff like that, or issuing debt. My concern is the provincial guidelines. So the provincial guidelines has the financial information return, specifies how much we have. If we get closer to the 25% or above, if we get above, we have to get special exception. If we get closer to the 25%, then IO, meaning our funding source, would be less likely to fund us, because then they look at our ability to pay. So at the increased threshold, you still have the ability to pay. You're not at the teetering point of 25% where they're kind of going, okay, great, you have 25%. How sure are you going to have the revenues coming in afterwards? So my concern, provincial guidelines underneath, IO, that's what they would look at. They would look at our FIR statement to understand how much of our own source revenue can fund debt. You're still within the guidelines for doing that. So it's not like we're issuing debt, not on the open market for issuing bonds and stuff like that. So we don't have like a credit rating as far as I know, and Charlotte can probably correct me again if I'm wrong. As such, the concern you have to have is your debt ceiling as it relates to your financial information return and your ability to pay debt. As long as you maintain a volume or level well below the 25%, you can continue to take debentures through IO, and that's where you typically go to the market.
So
Councillor?
does a municipality have a credit rating, and would that credit rating affect their borrowing ability or the interest rate that they're borrowing at?
So again, my experience with IO has simply been, what's your borrowing capacity? What's your debt capacity as it sits compared to the provincial guidelines? And we get questions from the regions as such, not in the sense of our borrowing capacity. We don't go outside of the provincial markets for such. They again look at your capacity and how much room you have.
Okay.
The more you decrease your room, the more subject to scrutiny. I would suspect that we get more questions in regards to our funding sources, how sure they are, but we haven't got to that stage.
Okay, thank you.
Last one, Councillor Russell?
Maybe.
Merry Christmas.
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Through you, not necessarily a question. Sorry, Madam or Councillor Timmers. Trying to find some middle ground so I can at least sleep half a night. Obviously, we have the ability to revisit this on a yearly basis.
Yep.
Like Councillor Murray, I am concerned about the risk of going all the way up to 18%. So what I would like to do is put on the floor an amendment to, for the time being, go up to 14%. Which will have no impact on the next couple years. We have the ability to revisit that and adjust according to the economy in 2025 for 2026, 2027. But it just also keeps a bit of a limit on ourselves. And that's what I'm concerned about. So again, it keeps us going for the next couple years, allows us to come back and revisit it. And again, I don't think it's going to have a big impact on the long-term plans, and we have that ability to adjust down the road. So I would amend, or put a motion on the floor to amend that the recommended guidelines be 15%, or sorry, 14% instead of 18.
Combined,
Yeah.
correct? Do we need a seconder,
No.
Madam Clerk?
No, that's just an amendment. So we haven't considered the motion first, but I can pull that up on the screen.
Okay.
And we would need council to actually vote on that amendment. I'll
First,
put the
yeah.
motion up, just give me one moment. But let
Director
Councillor-
Wagner, go ahead.
Through Chair Reimer to Councillor Russell, just to highlight, the fact is, and I said earlier, that in 2026, 2027, you're at 15%. So you would already be in contravention of your own prescribed threshold. If you want to do an all-in at 14%, you have to do it at 15% to maintain that because you're over. You get an exception from that front. So just as a point of clarity.
So,
Consideration?
yeah,
Council?
through you, Mr. Chair, again, maybe we then bump that to 15.
Could we see the motion,
Yep.
please, Madam Clerk?
It's highlighted, Chair?
So the amendment is the highlighted
Or sorry,
Script
bolded.
there?
It's bolded. My-
Bolded?
My apologies. Yeah.
that council approve the total value of debt not to exceed 15% combined. Any questions to the amendment from council? Ready for the vote?
All in favor, please raise your hands. On the amendment only, Counselor. Yes.
Those in favor, please raise your hand.
So I have Counselor Regima raised a hand. Counselor Russell. I'll need you to mark that down. Counselor Murray. All those opposed to that, please raise your hand. And I have Counselor Miklick. I have Chair Reimer, Mayor Easton, Counselor Pachariva, and Counselor Timmers that are opposed to that. Counselor Brunet, I didn't see your hand raised for either. So you're abstaining from voting? Yeah, I think so. Thank you.
Thank you. Seeing no other, Councillor Russell, you're good?
Oh, sorry.
Yep, no problem. Seeing no other discussion? Could you please read the motion for us, Madam Clerk?
So this is moved by Councillor Russell, that council receive and file as information the presentation provided by staff regarding the multi-year capital plan remapping exercise, and that council approve the total user rate and levy related debt not to exceed 10% target, and that council approve the total value of debt not to exceed 15% combined.
18. We just defeated that. So we need
I'm
to
sorry.
we need to remove that highlighted, the bold print,
Sorry.
and just change 15 to 18.
Thank you.
Which was the original motion.
Sorry about that. Not to exceed 18% combined, and that council directs staff to bring forward an annual report on debt projections, reserve balances, and any variances on capital works. I will put that to the vote, Councillor.
We're comfortable with that. Councillor Jima, you can read that it's not 15 as on the screen, it's 18.
I will save that.
You're good with that?
It's going to refresh.
Hold on a minute, Madam Clerk. Is it to the motion, Councillor? Go ahead, Councillor Russell. Hold on. There you are.
Can we have a recorded vote?
Yeah, we can. It refreshed, perfect. And the vote is now open, councillors.
It's not working.
Mayor Easton, you support the motion? Councillor Regima, I know you're having some technical issues. Can you please state what your vote is? It's either oppose or support.
Opposed.
Thank you. Chair Reimer,
Support.
and I will close that vote. And I will keep it on the screen so that you see. And that loses. Okay.
So we're looking for some direction then for staff as we continue this road. Do we have some comments or some questions? We had an amendment that was defeated, now we had a vote that was defeated. So looking for next steps. Councillor Timmers.
So we've now voted down this motion. We're sitting at 15%. We have a threshold of 10%. So where are we going to start cutting? What are we going to cut? Where are we going to get, how are we going to get down to 10? No? What are we going to do? Like, this doesn't make any sense.
Director Wagner, please go ahead.
So through Chair Reimer, I personally, you have 2023 projects that are underway, and most of them are planned. There may be a few that have to change or be removed or reduced, but I would suspect most are underway, so you can't necessarily cut. You have a 10% guideline. I believe that's what stays in force. And as such, it doesn't mean you actually change the plan. It means that you go down to that plan, which effectively simplifies the remapping exercise, that we start the discussions in 2031, because that's effectively where you'll be at for new capital works, remaining at 10%.
So for the next meeting, is it safe to say then that you could give us an outline of what that looks like on a,
Sure.
if that's we have our guidelines, we have our guideposts, if that's what they are, what that reality is? Is that enough? Is that enough direction?
Certainly, through your Chair Reimer, for sure.
Councillors have any Councillor Patriva. Go for it.
Yeah, Chair, so I'm perplexed. So we voted down 15%. And then we voted down 18. So, I mean, if the 15 was a compromise on the 18, so I'm just, one would, when you assume, look, yeah, you're making an ass of you and me, because one would think 15 would move to 18. So I'd like to know, to square it in my head, what the thought process was behind that, right? Because we've got, I mean, I go back to the water rates where we bring them in artificially at zero, and look what happens. We have professional staff that we should be leaning on heavily, but we don't. So, someone please explain it to me, because the science behind this, frankly, is lost on me.
Councillor Russell, please go ahead.
Thanks, Mr. Chair. Again, for me, the 18% was too much. That's why I brought the motion 15% to try to find that middle ground, and it was voted down. And you voted it down. You said no. So I don't understand the question of why you think if 15% is not acceptable, that we should automatically go to 18%. I just don't understand that.
Comments? Need some more direction here? I'll make one observation. Sorry, Mayor, before you go. I think an observation just to reply to Councillor Patriva and to Councillor Russell. This council, in the 5 years I've been part of it, gets very nervous around budget time, and you can't spend money when you're nervous. So that nervousness, or that apprehension, that has to change my feeling before we keep discussing this. Smart money is not always cheap money, and I think that apprehension, that nervousness has to be dealt with before we continue these conversations. So that's my 2 cents on that. Mayor Easton, please go ahead.
Well, I think I do have I have a concern with the level of confidence that council is going forward with in terms of the level of controls that are being put in place, and they're in black and white. They're there for us to use. This is a policy decision that that we are, I believe, that I would have believed that everyone was committed to this level of control, and that it was in our best interest to do this. The thought of not having any capital work done until 2031 is, I can't accept that. I don't even know how to describe it in terms of the well-being, the health and well-being of our community. And I don't know how to judge the complexity of how we begin to deal with provincial policy around moving forward with projects. At the same time, we're saying we're digging in our heels and we're not going to do any work. This is, I don't know, I understand the necessity of not spending more money than you need to. And it was my expectation that as we went through the capital plan and did that remapping, I anticipate that we will be very successful with that. But to not do any work at all until 2031 is, that tells me that whatever's been presented to us, that message didn't get across, didn't come across in the way that I'm interpreting it. I see these as very firm controls, very firm guidelines. We are in the driver's seat, nobody else. And this was the best way to get that information forward. So to not do any work until 2031, I mean, I don't know of any. Every ward councillor has ideas and ideals for their ward. So how do you shut down your wards? I mean, maybe somebody could explain that to me. This was not, I don't know what was attempting to be achieved here, but this is not a good result. I'll certainly do my very best, Mr. Chairman, to start thinking about some alternative language. Thank you.
Thank you, Mayor Eason. So going back to direction, Lawrence, for the next meeting, we will look at some type of forecast or some type of graphs that reflect 10%, using the number of 10% as opposed to the graphs we have today. And we can continue our discussion how that looks moving forward.
Through you, Chair Reimer, is pretty simple. I just move all the projects starting 2031.
Okay.
Because you have debt that's incurred.
Is it possible to have some, a little more in-depth now that we've got the guideposts of 10%? Is it possible to see some of those in a little more detail, what those actually affect, or?
Yeah, oh, definitely, because it's your 10-year plan,
Sure.
actually move stuff out. So we can go back through that dialogue and discussion.
Mr. Chairman, on process, could we please have Madam Chair explain, could we have Madam Chair explain to us when we come back, if we're going to be dealing with a reconsideration, are we within the time frame that we wouldn't have to have a reconsideration, we could put a new motion on the floor, what would be the process?
Madam Clerk, could you comment on that?
Madam Mayor, so we haven't delved into anything right now with the capital remapping strategy right now. So there is no reconsideration right now.
I'm talking about this motion, Madam Chair.
So this motion has lost. And so what would be on the floor is that council would direct staff to come back at a next meeting and provide that information to council for their consideration. I think that this motion right now, as it was laid out in the presentation, has failed. And so now we're moving on to another motion. And the chair will call for a mover for that once I have it all drafted.
Yeah.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Chair.
Lawrence, you're good?
Totally,
Ryder?
Councillor, yes.
Moving on to number 8, confidential items. We have no further confidential items. Okay, sorry about that, Julie. My apologies. Should we read it? Because it really looks like 10% Mr. CEO, you want to clarify something? Go ahead.
Through you, Mr. Chair, I think just to the conversation we're having while Julie's working on the motion. So what staff are going to bring back is what projects between now and 2031 will get pushed off starting in 2031 moving forward. So it'll be a pretty simple, I think, presentation that we're going to come back to you with overall. But we know the projects that go from 2024 to 31. So there's
now-
7 years worth of projects that are now going to start in 2031. So you want a list of those projects.
Now that we've established our threshold, then we see what that looks like. Exactly. Yeah, well, it hasn't stopped. I know. Okay, I'll read the motion, and I'll need a mover and a seconder. Receive and files information, the presentation provided by staff regarding the multi-year capital plan and remapping exercise, and that council directs staff to come back to the next meeting, April 24th, 2023, to review the 10-year remapping plan. Mover? You want to speak to the motion, Councillor?
Yeah, I just have a question.
Go right ahead.
So through you, Chair, I guess I'm confused. I thought we heard, or I thought I heard at least tonight, our Director of Finance saying that a 10-year remapping is something we shouldn't be looking at, that really it's a 20-year mapping. So I'm wondering why we're still seeing 10-year up on the screen. Because I heard throughout the presentation, we should be looking at a 20-year mapping, that a 10-year mapping is not realistic, but maybe I heard something different.
I think you heard that, but we've been referring to that. During budget, we referred to our as being extended among 10 years. If you want to make an amendment to
I think we're going to change it to multi-year.
we're going to change to multi-year.
I feel more comfortable with that.
Is that sir? So I need a mover and a seconder. Mover and a seconder for the motion. So moved by Mayor Easton. Seconded by Councillor Brunet. Thank you.
And that's open for voting. Councillor Rajima, with your technical issues, please state if you're opposed or in favor.
In favor, thank you.
Thank you. Close the vote. And that carries, Chair.
Thank you, Madam Clerk. Number 8, confidential items. We do not have any further confidential items tonight. Committee remarks, number 9. Does anybody have any remarks this evening yet? We all talked out. Seeing nobody, does our CEO have any closing remarks?
Through you, Mr. Chair, I mean, I always have some closing remarks. We will be in front of you on the 24th. And I guess I'd be remiss if I didn't thank Lawrence. This probably is one of the last presentations he will give, and notwithstanding, I think, the outcome of today, that I hope after further conversations, we'll find ourselves having a different conversation on the 24th. But I'll refrain from those comments and really thank Lawrence for tonight. But provide some, I think, some parting comments about Lawrence. And so all of you received my email a number of weeks ago. And as I said, I don't believe we have another meeting, so here's the best opportunity for me to make some comments. You know, as I said in that email, I'm both happy and disappointed to see the move and leap Lawrence is about to make as he becomes the CEO of the Ontario Building Officials Association. As the CAO, I feel pride, I said in that email to all of you, that we've continued to support the development and grow talented leaders. But I can say we're going to miss his contributions. In almost the 3 years that Lawrence has been here, throughout the pandemic, not an easy time, we've had his guidance, and I think we're in a good position to build on that foundation that he's put in place in the Finance, IT, and Innovation Department. As Council knows, in late 2020, we identified a number of opportunities in finance and IT to be more innovative, to raise the bar, and Lawrence was hired at that time. He had the skills we needed to professionalize those functions, and I'm glad we made the decision we did, and I think all of you would agree with me. We put in policies, brought in technology, and made sure the necessary checks and balances were in place. We looked at sustainability, integrated infrastructure, long-term planning, and all those things I said to you in that email. I won't read them all. Innovation was deliberately added because we saw that as an important piece and the role IT plays in running our business more effectively. In his new role as the CEO of the OBOA, as I said in his reference, I'm confident that he can lead them into the 21st century. There's a lot of advocacy and leadership work to do. I know they're excited to have Lawrence. We're sad to see him go, but he takes over an organization at a great time of need. And so on behalf of the entire team, and I think I speak for all of council, that I thank Lawrence for his service to our community. So thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Mr. CEO. Thank you, Lawrence. There being no further business, I call the meeting adjourned at 8:11.